Good morning from Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Google Hangout for Week 3, Private Finance for Development. I'm Gargi Ghosh. I'll be your moderator today. I'm the Director of Policy for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I'm here with a great panel. I'll have them introduce themselves. Aaron, will you start? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Aaron Muhlenberg. I'm with McKinsey & Company. I do primarily my work in power and the infrastructure sector and focus on catalyzing private sector capital into the developing markets. Working a lot with some of the donors as well as private investors on the topics that we're going to explore today.
Great, thank you. Tara.
Hi, I'm Tara Nathan. I'm with MasterCard Worldwide. I run international development, and international development is a function within MasterCard that looks at how we can create commercially sustainable businesses to accomplish development objectives. So working on things like financial inclusion, identity, gender, etc. Similarly, working with a lot of the development organizations from donors, funders, NGOs, etc.
Great, thank you. Maggie.
Thanks, Gargi, and good morning and hello to everybody. So I'm Magdi Amin. I manage corporate strategy and partnership for IFC. IFC is the largest development organization focused entirely on the private sector. And corporate strategy, we try to position IFC against the largest and most important development challenges and see how we can get aligned with the World Bank and other partners to help address them through the private sector. So I'm excited about today also.
Great, thank you. So as I understand, you've covered 4 key concepts this week, and these will be the tentpoles of our discussion today. First, sources of private finance for development, including philanthropic and for-profit capital. Second, motivations and drivers of that capital, including risk and reward. Third, ideas about how public and private finance work together, including some innovations. And fourth, a focus on infrastructure finance. So we've received a number of your questions in advance, a fairly large number, so we'll go through some of those in a sort of synthesized fashion. My job is to try and get us into a bit of dialogue. This hour will be much more interesting if we don't all just wait for questions and answers, so let's see if we can do that. Let's start. I'd like to hear from all of you. There is so much excitement about the private sector in development, and that really featured so prominently in Addis. Tell me what you're excited about and where you think maybe there's too much hype. Let's go in reverse order, Maggie.
Well, I'm really excited, and you really nailed it. I mean, this year we've seen a couple of things happening, both in Addis, Financing for Development, and in New York with the General Assembly and the SDGs, but also in the private sector, just a realization on all parts that the role of the private sector is really central to development in a way that sort of has been gradually the case over the last few years, but really came into focus this year. So I'm excited about that, just the realization that development really requires not only governments and civil society, but the private sector as well in a very large way. I'm also excited about the kind of innovation we're seeing, firms like MasterCard, ideas that are coming out of groups like McKinsey, things that we're trying also to really push the envelope, and of course the Gates Foundation as well. So I think there's a lot to be excited about. What I'm a little bit worried about sometimes is that in an attempt to spur this along, including sometimes in entrepreneurship, sometimes we see too much money, or money isn't necessarily the problem. It's really the ideas. So a money first approach sometimes can distort markets. And so that's a little concern.
Great, that's helpful. Tara, one myth you want to debunk and one that you want to confirm.
A myth that I want to confirm.
Yeah.
So I guess I would confirm, similar to, I think it's this notion that private sector plays a key role. Not only from the perspective of financing flows, but frankly from the perspective of expertise and sort of generating economic activity. I think that is sort of a key truism that I'd like to see explored more. I'm excited that there seems to be greater receptivity around engagement of the private sector and the legitimacy, that's maybe the word I'd like to use, the legitimacy of private sector in accomplishing key development objectives. I think the myth that I'd like to debunk is this notion of if you build it, they will come. If we say the words public-private partnerships, they will exist. And I think there's a lot of work we have to do collectively as a community to actually get there. Work around, governance, around eliminating perceived and real conflicts of interest on both the public side as well as on the private side. Rules and of governance and I think cultural norms around accepting the notion of corporates being profitable entities, around the legitimacy of profit or not in development contexts. So I think these are some of the things I'd like to see explored.
Great, thank you. Aaron?
Sure. I think just to touch on some themes that were raised by my co-panelists, I'm very excited at the level of interest that we're seeing in the private sector, period. There's some tremendous stories if you look at renewables and the way that the private sector pools of capital from everything from hedge funds through pension funds through banks has gotten so much more comfortable with infrastructure, particularly renewables, that has technology risk, sometimes an emerging markets risk, and this has created, put solar, frankly, as the largest new power generation technology that we're seeing, and has surpassed coal for the first time this year. So there's some tremendous stories in terms of the level of interest from the private sector. The innovation, as Maggie pointed out, is quite remarkable in terms of the push into yieldcos and finding ways to have sustainable infrastructure in developing worlds actually go to the capital markets, to the retail capital markets. So this kind of level of innovation is something that we just haven't seen at scale before. I think that ultimately the challenge, though, as Tara pointed out, is if you say that the private sector is there, it doesn't mean that the flows will be completely untapped immediately. So the conditions for success, the enabling environments, the clarity environments, the transparency, capital flows, all the things that we know are requirements for private sector investment have to be made even stronger than before. And I think what we've seen over the past year is a lot of learning between both the private sector, the public sector, and the MDBs as in terms of what the requirements are, what the rates of return are. That learning has to continue, and ultimately the enabling structures have to be put in place to facilitate that. I mean, just as in terms of the numbers, I'm focusing on infrastructure, which is what I'm focused on. We really spend about $3 trillion a year. Less than half of that is private sector at this point, and more than 70% of that private sector is actually corporate. So large corporate investment in infrastructure. That means that we're only spending a small proportion from the financial institutions that hold our pensions, that hold our insurance policies. There's tremendous opportunity for growth in terms of that capital, but it only is going to happen through the coordination.
Great, thank you. Let's get into some of the specific questions that came from participants. Aaron, I want to stay with you for another minute. We had a question about pension funds, and there's a lot of excitement about sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, when people talk about sort of the trillions of dollars of private sector money available for development. This is one of the sources that often comes up. Do you buy it? And what are the conditions under which you think we can unlock some of that long-term investment capital in the development sector?
So the numbers speak to that observation, to that fact. If you look at the assets available for investing, at least particularly in infrastructure, but generally in development, 80% of that is in the hands of pension funds, large insurance companies, and also banks as well. I mean, the challenge is that they are and should be, based on their fiduciary duty, conservative investors, and so their ability to take high risks is limited. And I think what we're seeing is the trends of innovation that we just alluded to. That is the hope, and that is the challenge. So the pools of capital are clearly there. The interest to invest in long-term, reliable cash flows and assets, which actually fit the profile of infrastructure and a lot of development assets, is there as well. The bridge, the mechanisms, the way to de-risk the investment for the pension funds, the way to actually create liquidity in the market, which is a prerequisite for pension fund investment. That's where we're going to see the innovation. And again, in some of the project bonds, some of the yieldco tools that have come to market, that's been seen. Of course, there's bumps in that road, and it's easier said than done. But that being said, I think the pension fund capital is a great opportunity. The education process for those investors has gone incredibly well over the past few years, thanks to a lot of actors in the market. And I think we will see that allocation, although gradually we will see it increase the allocation to development.
If you comment on this, especially the liquidity issue. So we hear a lot about the need for deeper capital markets in the developing world in order to motivate investment, and clearly that's necessary for domestic savings investment as well. What progress are we making there? Where do you think? What are best practices? Where are the leading countries?
Okay. So there's two parts to that question. It's a great question. Part of it is development of deeper capital markets. So there are plenty of large and liquid capital markets in developed countries, but the places that need infrastructure the most, that tends to be pretty scarce. There is work that's being done. IFC, the World Bank, and other development institutions that issue bonds that we're financed from the capital markets can use our bond issuing processes to help those capital markets deepen. In Rwanda recently, we've issued bonds, including green bonds, to help develop that capital markets. The governments themselves can start issuing on a regular basis in order to sort of develop a yield curve and develop the practice of moving some of their savings into capital markets. There's a lot of work on regulatory capacity that's needed. The SEC equivalents, the institutional investors themselves. Sometimes there's also regulatory restrictions that keep them from investing in infrastructure. So they'll be putting their money into sort of AAA, even treasury paper from developed countries rather than develop their own markets and instruments. Now, on the infrastructure side, we're starting to see this work, as Erin was mentioning. A great example is Colombia, where recently been financing toll road program 4G. It involved a lot of work on risk mitigation, a lot of work on developing the regulatory capacity to look at and to transform these revenue streams coming from the toll road process into instruments that institutional investors and the capital markets can then buy. It's worked very well, and it's going to be a program where a number of other infrastructure projects will then be developed through or financed through the capital markets. It involved a lot of coordination and a lot of work over a long time, but we think that's paying off. Now, Colombia is at one end of this fairly developed market. It will take time, but we would want to see this then spread into other regions and more lower income countries as well.
Great, thanks. Tara, as you do your work for MasterCard, how do you think about the role of public money in assisting the entry of private firms, capital into the developing world?
I think it's a lot like Erin and Mugby have articulated. It's really about de-risking. So I think when you look at, I think a really successful public-private engagement is one where public dollars can incent private sector to come in and do what they do as their core business in a market or in a capacity or in a new way they wouldn't have done it previously. Right? There are umpteen examples. One, we actually have a partnership with the IFC doing a similar type of risk mitigation fund. What is that fund meant to do? It's really tackling the issue of financial inclusion. So we sort of say, look, we absorb a certain amount of risk as a company for settlement risk across our network for institutions that are part of our network. Well, in order to get to the bottom of the pyramid, we know we have to go and reach out to sort of tier 2, tier 3 type of institutions. And in partnership with the IFC, we've built a risk mitigation sort of capability that enables us to do that. That's a classic example to me of something where we say, hey, look, we may not have been able to extend a franchisee licensing to this type of entity, but now we can.
I think financial inclusion is a great example, actually one that we're involved in as well, where our role is to help build this market faster than it would build otherwise, especially in the developing world, by supporting regulators to upskill on regulating correspondent banks to sort of build the digital guardrails. But in the end, this is going to be a private industry. You could put sort of philanthropic capital in to the industry, but it's not clear that's needed when this industry is fully going. So it's about sort of prompting the beginning of things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're spot on. I think especially in the area of financial inclusion, there is an element of, regulatory stimulus or encouragement, I think, right? So looking at things like tiered KYC, things that frankly, even more basic than that, just fair trade, frankly, in the market is something that is not really always something we can take for granted, right? So can global players come and play on equal footing with sort of local national schemes? That's something that I think is helpful. How can you bring to bear, I think a word that we like to bat around a lot is this concept of innovation. And it's something we're very passionate about. At MasterCard, we have a culture of innovation, I'd say, that centers around sort of the core of everything we do. But I think, how can we apply this innovation capability, not just to gadgets and gizmos, which is where a lot of the focus goes. I mean, Aaron and I were having a conversation on how there's all kinds of, venture capital and there's good money chasing bad money into innovations that already exist. You can't innovate on something that already exists, right? So how do we leverage? I think what I'm really interested in is how do we leverage private sector expertise, especially the folks who have been doing this in their lanes forever. MasterCard's been doing financial inclusion for 50 years, next year, 50 years. There's companies in the telco space, there's companies in the power space who do this day in and day out. How can we leverage that expertise is what I'm really interested in to sort of provide more informed guidance to the way development dollars and private sector dollars are being invested in a coordinated fashion. I think that's when we're going to get real traction on the innovation, right? Opposed to 15 new prepaid cards, or what were you were talking about, the reinventing the same payment mechanisms for, that exist over and over again.
Let's talk about leverage for a second, because I think as we, and especially as this course covers public and private, this is the place where we see so much excitement and enthusiasm, but also a lot of fear, right? That public dollars will be used just to elevate profits of the private sector, and how do we feel about that, et cetera. And I hope I'm not misattributing this quote, but I think it's Larry Summers. She says, everybody likes to leverage and nobody likes to be leveraged. So let's talk about some examples of really good PPPs where public dollars were used to really bring innovation or push the private sector further than it otherwise would have gone. We all work in this space. Give me your favorite example, or more interesting if you have a bad example that we shouldn't have done. But Aaron, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think just first, and it's a great question, right? And this is the debate that is happening all over. And I think, frankly, collectively, we actually probably need better information and data as to when PPPs really do save on cost and time, right? And ultimately, that ends up being the debate. Is the government has a lot of attributes, has a lot of talents, has a lot of resources, but ultimately, some governments are not the best at delivering infrastructure. It's not a core capacity, a core business. I think we'll find that some governments are quite good at doing it, however, right? And so if you look at some of the roads authorities, for example, in Northern Europe, they're very good at delivering roads. They're very good at managing CapEx programs, and in many ways, they are delivering at least cost. However, if you look at some examples like the UK that decided that actually we think our private sector is able to deliver projects, schools, hospitals, roads through the PFI program that they set up at a more effective cost, a lower cost to the taxpayer, then that kind of gets informed through policy. So I think the UK example is an excellent one where actually there's quite a bit of data showing that costs were reduced through a good data set of government-run projects compared to PPP's PFI projects. The data we could improve in other places. Ultimately, there's a lot of focus also on the cost of financing, right, and how expensive equity is, how from the private sector, how expensive private sector debt is. Ultimately, what we often find is that additional cost, is more than compensated through the efficiencies that a private sector entity can bring to the table, who has built the same bridge 10 times or has built the road 10 times. If the auction or the PPP process doesn't allocate risks in the right way and expects the private sector to do more than it normally does in its normal course of business, as Tyler mentioned, then it gets very expensive. And ultimately, some PPPs have failed based on that. I think another great example is some of the IWPP power programs in the Middle East, the GCC, so the water and power programs in the Middle East. Very good programs that started 15 plus years ago, where the government recognized they had limited capacity to develop large-scale power, but they were focused on bringing that in-house. And so partnered with the private sector, both on the financing as well as the development, the O&M, and put together very sound programs where the government got very good value for money and also retained ownership, and additionally was able to train a lot of its local population to build capabilities. So I think there's some very good examples in the kind of classic IPP model that go to that point.
Great, thank you.
I want to build on one point, then I'll answer the question, which is this notion of, I like the focus has to be on efficacy and output opposed to input. I think what happens is when you get into this PPP realm, there's too much focus on how much money is being made, what's the discount over rack rate, how much does the CEO make, right? What the CEO makes should be irrelevant to the conversation, and it should be, to your point, a measure of efficacy or output for the price. What's the value for the dollar that you're paying? So I liked that point. I think when I think of PPPs, I think, and I don't know if this is controversial, it probably is if I'm saying it, but I think, I don't know that there
Lucky
are.
for you, there are only 5,000.
Yeah, okay.
Things.
I don't know that there are. I don't know that public-private partnerships, in how I would connote them, truly exist today. Okay. I think what I see a lot of is prevalence on the purely commercial side, which is let's concoct this enormously convoluted RFP that we then tender that no one can actually respond to in an efficient, meaningful way, because entities who are formulating the RFP don't have the expertise to actually construct a meaningful RFP. I think that there's a lot of that, which necessarily then produces inefficient outcomes. I think sometimes we call these PPPs. I think on the extreme other side, we have a lot of partnerships which are philanthropic. So Brookings recently did an assessment of a number of PPPs across a number of different donor agencies, and what they found out was, a lot of what they came back to at least us with was philanthropic donations. So if a corporate's making a philanthropic donation, that's not a partnership, that's a donation. That's a philanthropic sort of endeavor. What I think is really interesting is how do we unpack this center concept of a true public-private partnership? And if we think what that word partnership means, it means we're both getting something out of this. So I think we just need to be really frank and honest about what do you want? What are you trying to, and everyone at the table who's part of that partnership should be upfront about, this is what I need now. Whether it's development outcomes, whether it's innovation, whether it's profit. I think a lot of companies come to the table with the notion that what they're going to get out of it is a corporate social responsibility type of outcome. But I think that is that's dangerous. It's a mythical solution because it's not scalable. So if we're looking to solve the world's most pressing problems, and we're claiming that there's a 2 trillion or 3 trillion, I don't know what the number is now, I'm sure my World Bank colleagues will be able to answer that. Yeah, gap, right? Gap for you're not going to get it through CSR dollars, okay? You may get $1 million that I'll flip your way to buy some bicycles, but it's not going to be sustainable. The way you're going to get us to the table in a really meaningful way is when we can come up with commercial models that solve this issue in a sustainable way. I think if I can just add one more thing.
Yeah, sorry.
One, I would say, example, I think of this that's really headed in that right direction is actually one that we did with the Gates Foundation. And it is, so the Gates Foundation gave a grant to MasterCard Corporate. I don't know, it was very, it was very innovative for us to open up an innovation lab focused on financial services for the poor. If you think about it, so we have a labs, a financial innovation capability. We build labs around the globe. We've got 10+ labs that we do. Typically, we don't focus on base of the pyramid, okay? And typically, we've been located in countries like, we're in Australia, we're in the US, we're in St. Louis, we're in, the UK, we're in Dublin. This lab is based in Nairobi, Kenya. That to me is a brilliant example of saying, look, we want you, we know that you're the best at innovation in financial service products, go do it, but do it for my segment, do it for my countries, and produce these outcomes. And we're being held to very sort of strict outcomes. And to me, it goes back to Erin's point of measure the development outcomes, measure what are the deliverables and what's the efficiency of how I could have spent that dollar with you versus how I could have spent it elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Maggie, I want to make the question slightly harder for you
Sure.
since you had a chance to
Sure,
sit and
listen.
think. We've had a number of questions from our participants on the extractive sector in particular, which obviously features prominently in many developing countries.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the role of the kind of public-private compact around the
Right.
extractive sector.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that is a tough question.
Yeah.
Thanks for giving
You're welcome.
that. Well, I'm actually pretty excited about some of the development that's been happening in extractives. Now, of course, with the last year or so, the substantial drop in commodity prices across the board, some of the economics of this has changed. But as we were heading into 2015, you started to see a lot more emphasis on what the extractive sector is doing for the country in development. Focus on local content, and some of the policy approaches were maybe trying to reach a little bit too far and sort of demanding a little bit too quick or too much to be reinvested. But the supply chains for extractive sectors create a lot of opportunities for businesses to thrive. We've seen approaches, for example, in Simandu, a very large mine that is creating a lot of potential long-term growth. But in order to get that mine running, it requires the development of a railroad. It requires a lot of different products and services that we're training the private sector locally to provide. Now, part of the impact of the extractives from a local development standpoint comes from the fact that infrastructure, that railroad, the same example could be having in Mozambique with another project, is dual use and creates opportunities to unlock agriculture, manufacturing, and other services to develop the country. So the extent to which you can get dual use infrastructure from extractives, the extent to which you can get local content and local products and local firms providing products into those supply chains, it's quite helpful. Now, what's really most important in the long run is that the extractives are managed in a way that's transparent and that does not create sort of the Dutch disease where because of the way those exports might bid up the currency of that country, other things become uncompetitive. It's really also macroeconomic management. So I do see, so there's a lot of hope, a lot of lessons have been learned, and people are doing a better job of it. Now with prices the way they are, maybe on the margin, some of the local content opportunities might be harder to reach because countries are trying to compete for the scarce, mining dollars that are out there, and only the best opportunities will be exploited today. But that cycle will end, and then we'll hopefully see better partnerships between firms, good, responsible firms, and there are many, and the extractive sector, and the countries that have those resources. But I just want to come back to this partnerships question.
Yeah. And sorry, Maggie,
Yeah.
let me just correct something because some of our participants have put their finger on. We're using PPPs in the most general sense of public and private getting together to do something good in development.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a tighter definition of PPPs that is around a specific project.
Yeah.
Project finance. So
Right.
just to clarify, we're using it in the broad kind of conceptual sense.
Okay. Well, all of development we now know is a PPP. It is about the government, private sector, and civil society working together around challenges.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's great examples. We've seen, for example, in the health sector where you might have a hospital that can do well commercially, but that the additional cost of reaching low-income consumers and service users, potential patients, might need, in the short run, a small amount of subsidy. But that small amount of subsidy is far cheaper than to try to create an entirely public-driven system on the ground. So on the margin, sometimes there's a role for leveraging small amounts of public money, but then leveraging it with the power of the private sector then that could deliver that services sustainably. We like partnerships that are now happening with cities. We've seen in Turkey and Izmir the focus on getting some of that infrastructure done sustainably in a green way, but then has translated into the ability to issue cheaper bonds so that Izmir can then finance itself. We like what's happening in the solar, as Aaron was mentioned. Maybe in the first few rounds, solar prices are coming down quickly. Initial auctions, there might need to be a little bit of a margin. First of all, technical assistance, but maybe a little bit of a margin to bridge the gap between sort of very cheap fossil fuel sources and solar. But as the markets get mature and more competition happens, and as the technologies come down, eventually you move to commercial delivery. So early bridging the gap, getting the markets to work, providing the technical assistance, there's extremely well leveraged forms of money, public money, that then create real, true commercial opportunities.
Great, thank you. I want to pick up on your point about cities, and in fact, we have a question coming in on subnational governments. So obviously, it falls to subnational, state, provincial, city governments to deliver many of the services that matter to people, health, education, etc. Their ability to raise revenue is constrained. There's the Izmir example, but there are many counterexamples. Dakar was unable to issue a bond. So what do you see happening at the subnational level? What do you think needs to happen more of? What's been your involvement in subnational level financing? Aaron, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, sure. I'll pick it up and then we can discuss
Sure.
that. So it's a great question, and I would say we're in many ways at the beginning of thinking about solutions and innovating that.
Yeah.
That having been said, we do have a lot of models in the U.S., for example, the muni bond market, which has had its ups and downs, but has been quite successful and helpful in creating a liquid environment for investors to support cities and states in financing infrastructure. There's a number of questions. Can you replicate that in other places, right? It's a question of how deep the market is locally. As Mikey pointed out, in many of these countries, the local capital market, which actually funds these muni bonds, usually the tax benefits isn't there. So yeah, sometimes it doesn't work. We're only starting to see in the emerging markets really a deeper market for sovereign at the national level issuances, right? So the credit metrics, the engagement with the rating agencies, the investor education process, all those things that are required to create a liquid market for bonds of a sovereign or sub-sovereign are really just starting. That having been said, if you look at maybe some of the more developed markets like the GCC, where you have some of the Emirates who have been issuing for some time for infrastructure programs, and now we're seeing some of the larger cities, which truly are the drivers of the economy, as we know, and also the sites of population. So I think just to cut to the chase, increased concerted effort is happening in the market to understand the credit profile of cities, to understand them as very creditworthy counterparties to the extent that their ability to tax is in place, to the extent that they can monetize some of their classic government services. There needs to be a lot more innovation in how governments provide services and how they monetize them and how they create transparency through the life cycle of that cash flow to get investors interested. And then, of course, there's more innovation instruments. That having been said, we have a lot of great models, right? We issuing kind of municipal financing instruments is something that has been going on for a long time. So it's really a matter of creating the transparency and the capability at the city level. But it's quite exciting. I think that we're seeing that issue in the U.S., right, where most of the demand for infrastructure is very much at the local and state level, but a lot of the financing to some degree has been allocated at the federal level. So that mismatch is a global issue.
I think Aaron nailed it. I just wanted to add that mayors and cities are a really big source of innovation and development right now. Very excited by what we saw in terms of the response to Paris coming out of the private sector and cities. We're also seeing some of the most innovative and interesting ways to make cities more sustainable. And as Aaron said, look, cities are where the private sector can thrive because sometimes the private sector requires the ecosystem to be developed, but also agglomeration really matters. Development happens when a lot of forces are at work at the same time. Financing, infrastructure, policy, regulation. Sometimes it requires scale, which requires concentration. So it's natural that you see cities as drivers or nice laboratories for development. Now with the ideas that are starting to come in, and the mayors as, in a way, drivers of innovation. We're seeing I think, quite the start of a nice little revolution. We're excited about it.
Great, thank you.
I think, yeah, we think about, I think, the city issue from maybe two different dimensions. One is really this concept of transparency and how can digital payments infrastructure create transparency within a given economy, right? And that obviously happens at the city level. What we've seen is that can drive incredible amounts of efficiency. The more you digitize an economy, we've done studies and seen studies that talk about the cost to produce, manage, and operate cash can be upwards of 1.5% to 2% of GDP, right? So that's a huge operational cost of cash that can then be reinvested in the city if it's spent better. If you add on top of that the issues of corruption, of things falling off the truck, of fraud and whatnot, that number has ranged from 5 to 10% I've seen in terms of loss of capital flows. So I think this issue of transparency and of, as we're thinking about cities and smart cities, how we incorporate into it the notion of building a digital infrastructure is something that we think a lot about. I think built into that, or sort of part of that, this touches on the issue of remittances to me, because it's not just creating greater efficiency within the cities and the economies in which we're operating, but how can digital infrastructure encourage actually flows of income into a given market or into a given city? And you'll quote the numbers better than I will, but we know that there are many nations for whom remittances outstrip sort of ODA, FDI, all that combined. And in that, I mean, and I've seen just anecdotally, you can go to entire cities in southern China where, it's an oasis in the middle of nowhere that's completely been built out. You talk about infrastructure buildup. You see high rises and water and houses and everything completely being built off of this notion of remittances from overseas sources of funds. And I think the extent to which we can digitize it is the extent to which we can sort of ensure that there is transparency and efficiency, and that those funds go to where they're intended.
Yeah, great. Tara, can you pick up on this point of creditworthiness and credit profiles? This is an issue, I think, at all levels, from the individuals who we're trying to reach with financial services to cities, sub-sovereign entities. What are some of the innovations you're seeing in how we assess and understand creditworthiness?
There's a lot of cool innovations in this space, actually. At the heart of it, yeah, we need to, when we're talking about especially populations that are off-grid or that are not included, the idea is, how do we get a sense of their creditworthiness? I think some of the things we're doing is, for example, this partnership we talked about with the IFC, it's exactly that. Can we come up with, I think that approach is very much of it's not a new way of assessing creditworthiness, it's a new way of dealing with the risk, I think, of creditworthiness of sort of tier 2 institutions. When you talk about new innovations in the sphere of assessing individual level risk, they've got psychometric tests. I mean, we have a partnership with EFL Labs out of Harvard that's doing things like, can you do behavioral diagnostics to understand better how someone, would perform in a credit situation? I think some of the stuff we're doing at MasterCard, which I'm really interested in, is how can just starting to track someone's digital signature or digital payment behavior, how can that start to create a credit profile, right? So that's some of the interesting work. Again, that's some of the benefits of digitizing. You start to create a digital signature and footprint that then can be leveraged by that individual, to get credit, to get access to many other sort of capabilities.
Great, absolutely. I want to switch gears a bit to one of the questions that's just come in from our participants, and this is around political risk. There has been a long-standing, not myth, but perception that the political risk in the developing world is so great that the private finance sources can't or won't come in. Have we made progress on that? And what's needed next? How big of an issue is political risk or stability our question actually asked about democracy, but I think that's even harder. How prominently does that feature as you think about private investment? Aaron, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I think quickly the studies that have been done on, say, PPPs narrowly between the emerging markets and the developed markets actually show that there's not too much of a difference in terms of default, right? Nationalization is relatively rare. In the scheme of things, political risk is an issue, but actually it manifests very much in the development cycle. Early stage, less so when the projects have been structured. So issues related to clarity on land rights, land reform, those are very real political risk issues that are, I think, holding back development. At the same time, political risk in its big shape of nationalization or defaults after changes of governments are relatively rare when it comes down to it. So I think the key point is that this risk is mitigated by products that World Bank offers. It's mitigated by guarantees that the governments provide often, but really the private sector tends to see it be best mitigated through institutional structures and capability and a long-term view of the government towards infrastructure, towards development. And so what the private sector is really looking for is true partnerships, is not just one-off investment opportunities, but a pipeline of investment opportunities, strong regulatory structure, strong ministries, kind of lifetime administrators, that type of framework that actually creates the conditions for lessening the political risk beyond the natural political cycle. Because at the core, a lot of the development financing, infrastructure financing, there is a mismatch between the political cycle and the life cycle of the project. And so that mismatch is at the core of the risk that has to be allocated in this investment. And really the way around that is enduring political institutions and long-term plans that actually reinforce the private sector's comfort with political risk.
Great, thanks. Let's have everybody build on that. How do you see risk these days? What risks are you worried about in your business?
I tend to think that, political risk is priced into your business model. I mean, and I think that's the way we need to think about it. I think there's a real great opportunity for public sector entities to help private sector, gain, I guess, de-risk even from a political perspective, right? So I think, for us, the way we mitigate and the way we think about it is through partnerships directly with governments. We place a lot of emphasis on direct partnerships with all the governments in the markets in which we operate. I think another key aspect for us is we're local in each market. So for us, the notion of political risk, I think, is very different. We're present in over 200 countries and territories, more than the UN, we like to say. So when you're a local in that market, I think our notion of what risk means, again, it alters because we're locals. I would bring it back to this notion of developing viable business models. I think the extent to which we can do that and create those infrastructures, we entice not just corporates, but local private sector entities to sort of grow and develop and flourish.
Great.
So I'm to take that question in a slightly long-term view. So if we go back a couple of decades, the perception of emerging markets was that the political risks, the opportunities to invest there were far beyond what the sort of global private sector, corporate sector might consider doable. I think there's a broad realization that we understand we're part of, and that's where the long-term growth opportunities are. The tendency toward more and more focus on emerging markets and differentiating those that have better and worse political policy regulatory environments is there now. So it's really a different picture. But there's another issue. As this sort of long-term pendulum has swung toward more engagement with the private sector and more growth, we're also seeing inequality. And inequality plays out in ways that do pose a political risk, I would say, to the private sector and to this broad notion of opening markets and helping to create a mixed sector and one where the private sector can flourish. Part of the answer to that is the private sector itself adopting sustainable and good practices, being mindful of regulation. Another part of it is good regulation, smarter regulation. And if we're talking about earlier about the public-private partnerships, we see very many situations where there's a lot of subsidies involved in holding up sectors with artificially low prices, or where, let's say, a utility is used to serve political purposes rather than help the sector provide overall services to everyone. So well-designed, smart regulation can help address the inequality and the role of the private sector. So I would say, the long-term trend is good. There are instruments to deal with short-term political risks to provide comfort. But on the one hand, better regulation. On the other hand, the private sector, leaders in the private sector, setting the model, setting the template, how good, sustainable private investment is done is very important.
I would just add from our perspective, the flip side of risk is information asymmetries, right? So even in our business, the accessibility of information about markets, about depth of markets is a real barrier. So, if I had a wish, it would be in the health sector here, you've got IMS Health, you've got so many sources of data on health markets. In financial services, we and others invested in Findex, which is a first demand side survey of what consumers actually want in terms of financial products. We need more of this kind of consumer data and information to really debunk some of the myths about risk and make the markets more accessible. I want to go back to some of the questions, if we can go back to that page, and I apologize, I haven't been naming people who've asked questions, so I will start to do that now. So we have two questions that I think are sides of the same coin. Obviously, we're having parallel conversations about financing at the micro individual firm level and the macro country level. And we have two questions about groups that are perhaps going to be left out of the private finance interest. On the macro side, what about small island states and other vulnerable countries who are not going to be as attractive to private capital? And that question's from Paula. And on the micro side, innovation and startups who won't be as exciting to private capital, especially from abroad. That question's from Javier. So what advice do you have, or are we wrong in thinking that some groups are going to be left out of the private finance trend? Anybody want to say?
I'd say, on the private sector side, and there is a whole lot of attention and money and funding being spent towards startups. And I think innovation and investment in startups.
In the developing world.
In the developing world, yeah. As we talked about, that's what the whole Gates Lab, what our lab in Africa is really aimed at. It's investing and incubating and developing out and partnering with local startups, frankly, to do just that. Because I think the idea that we have is that solutions for the developing world will come from the developing world in a lot of cases. So just because the entity involved doesn't mean the output or the company can't be huge. So again, for us, when we look for the ability to partner, and when we look at the opportunity and innovation, it's really about what's the potential impact it can have. And I think we have a lot of faith, and they're doing a lot of investment internally and partnering externally, and in small startups.
Great. Aaron, I just want to come in on who's going to be left out.
Yeah, so I think I would agree. I think there is a lot of various of activity focused on startups in emerging markets. There's over 250 plus private equity and venture firms that have set up just to focus on Africa alone. There's a lot of attention. I think the challenge there is how do you scale? How do you grow those companies into be something even beyond SMEs and become even national champions? And then where's the liquidity story for the investors in that market? So I think that is yet to be solved. And so hopefully the maturity of the market will allow the interest in startups to create sustainable growth stories for them. But I think it is a positive sign. on some of the island nations, or I would add just small countries generally. I think this is a very challenging situation, in that what we've seen, for at least for infrastructure, for some of the pools of capital from banks, pension funds, is the transaction costs to understand the small market are simply too high to justify investment, even with the expanded understanding and interest in emerging markets. And so, to the extent that small countries can collaborate amongst themselves, can work in regional trade organizations, can work collaboratively, where they can pool the capability to develop a pipeline of projects, where they can pool the resources, frankly, to market themselves, to attract investors. That's really the way that we've seen it. And frankly, it's worked in ASEAN and other larger regional setups, where really the investor base needs to have a broader palette or opportunity set in order to engage. So that's a real concern. Some of the development organizations are doing tremendous work in some of the smaller countries, but the transaction costs still remain high until this type of efficiency can be created.
Great. Monty, as usual, you get the harder version of the question. What is the IFC doing to help in this regard?
So, I mean, the question of exclusion is a really, really important one and a serious one. And so we know that when given the opportunity, those that have been excluded, women, in some regions, youth, small countries and regions, do have innovative solutions that can scale. Oftentimes they face barriers. They face very tough regulatory environments where who you know and who you can pay might be the way into an opportunity. So for us, getting regulation right, working with other colleagues, working with governments, working with the World Bank and others to reduce the friction and to make regulation streamlined and simple helps those groups that would otherwise be excluded. Financial inclusion is essential. Skills, education, whether it's public or private or nonprofit, is really essential to get to those groups. Vocational training, education that's relevant to the market. But in the end, competition, right? So even small excluded markets or even large markets, if they set up and raise barriers to competition, they become small. And it's a short-sighted, short-term way of looking at things. So don't make yourself artificially small. And if you're small, make sure that the transaction costs are low so you have a chance. Because any market can be viable even if it's small. But also big markets can be very unviable with the wrong framework. So we're focused on getting regulation right, but also helping on inclusion through finance, through using value chains and supply chains to link excluded groups to markets.
Great, thank you. We have just about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask for 30-second sort of closing reflections on any of the questions that you've seen or that we've talked about. Tara, can I start with you, and then I'll circle around. I'm going to do a different order this time.
Closing thoughts. I think the salient points that have sort of emerged for me is, number one, a lot of hope and enthusiasm around the potential and the power of private sector to create transformational change across key development issues. I think the power of the private sector to play a critical role in innovation, innovating not just technological innovation, but innovation of business models and an innovation of go-to-market strategies. I have a lot of enthusiasm, and I've heard a lot of positive reinforcement around the notion of how public and private can partner together in order to de-risk private sector engagement. But I'll close with the caution or the call to action, I guess, of in order for this to work, and in order for us to really talk about how actually PPPs are going to support the SDGs and how we're going to actually start implementing this, we need to start getting down to an operational and tactical level that says, what are those legal operational constructs, commercial constructs, that are going to enable these partnerships to thrive?
Great, thank you.
Closing thoughts. So I think where we started, I want to just come back to that. We're at a great moment with realization in the private sector and in the public sector and civil society of the importance of getting this great engine of entrepreneurship going on development. And the realization that when a firm thrives, it creates jobs, it delivers services, and in the end of the day, it even pays the government in terms of taxes. How can we harness that on the most important and difficult challenges? How can we bridge the serious challenges that the governments face with the interest of the private sector in helping solve those problems? I think we're in a great moment. I love the innovation that's happening, but it's a long, hard, difficult slog, and we'll keep working on it.
Thank you. Aaron?
Just, I think quickly, a couple themes that we've covered has really been how important coordination is between the public and private sector. And that's obviously a broad topic, but we've seen a lot of barriers be broken down. We've seen a lot more communication over the past couple of years, and I'm also very optimistic. But truly finding ways to coordinate between the both core capabilities and capacities of the private sector and the public sector, the need, the development for social impact goals, and who's going to be responsible for achieving those in a transaction, in a program, in a funding regime, whatever it may be, kind of actually getting to the core of what coordination means and then operationalizing it. That's our challenge as we start to implement the SDGs. And I think one of the key themes that comes into that is really how we have to shift how we evaluate credit and how we integrate data into essentially every decision that we make for transparency to improve the credit quality, but also to help the coordination mechanisms work better.
Great, that's great. And maybe I'll just add my own 2 cents. In closing, I think a lot of this can feel theoretical in practice. I just came this morning from a panel discussion with head of a major philanthropy, my boss, head of a major global bank, the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Finance from Mexico, all talking about how they could work together to really ramp up financial services for the poor in the next 3 to 5 years. And that was not a discussion we were having, I would say, even 5-8 years ago. So I think there's real momentum and willingness now. Great, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for your questions and your participation. The video is available on YouTube, I'm told, and you can continue the discussion via Coursera. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Barry.